All right, everyone. I'm recording this presentation called Contentious Land Change in the Eastern Amazon as kind of a way to illustrate some of or to go over some of the concepts in the reading for this week, and also to show you how geographers approach human environment interaction. This is some research that I've been working on for a number of years now. What I'm going to present today was eventually published in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers in this article, Contentious Land Change in the Amazon's Arc of Deforestation, by myself, Steve Aldrich, and others. There's actually has generated a newer project to look at this in more detail, but I figured I'd give you kind of the motivation, and this is something that comes after this week's reading. So this week's reading kind of was the first thing. The Amazon Land War is the paper, and then this is a presentation that shows how some of those connections between environment and conflict over land resources does lead to environmental damage, and then in the future there'll be more work coming out on this as well. So anyway, contentious land change in the Eastern Amazon, and essentially I'm going to give you a presentation that kind of works out like this. I'm going to give you some discussion of the problem, present the study area where the actual analysis that I'm going to show you comes from, give you a conceptual framework of how these things relate to one another, talk about data and models, show you some models, but I'm going to brush over that fairly quickly because looking at tables full of statistical information can be boring, and then talk to you about conclusions and policy implications, and then what's going on now. So anyway, deforestation in the Amazon is a pretty well-known problem, and since the late 80s, deforestation has increased and decreased on an annual basis, ranging from a low, most recently, of under 5,000 square kilometers of deforestation each year, but with some high peaks just shy of 30,000 square kilometers of deforestation each year. But the thing is, despite the fact that currently deforestation in the Amazon is lower than it has been, each year that there's a deforestation, we increase the amount of land that's been cut in the Amazon, meaning we're decreasing the amount of kind of mature forest, and the cumulative impact's been pretty significant. Since 1988, over 400,000 square kilometers of forest have been cut down. So, these are the annual amounts of deforestation shown, just to kind of show you the difference between the annual rates, which sometimes it seems like, oh, they're doing really great, but the cumulative impacts just keep rising. And so the idea here is that we can look at how land conflict, and I'll talk about how that actually comes about, can actually connect to land change or deforestation. So land conflict comes about through a variety of mechanisms that we take from contentious politics, which is actually a frame of knowledge or a way of knowing about kind of claim making outside of political spectrum. So basically, if you were angry at the political situation in your country or your town, you have established ways to make that known. You could protest or write a letter or even go talk to a representative or your mayor or something like that. Contentious politics is about what happens when those avenues don't work, and what people do outside of those avenues, those commonly accepted ways. And when you combine that with certain characteristics that are unique to geographic locations, you can often get land conflict, and that's the case in the Eastern Amazon at least, but across much of Latin America. And then if we combine the fact that this land conflict's happening with kind of knowledge about what causes people to change the landscape, we can see how land conflict relates to deforestation. Now, when we talk about land change science, we have kind of a well-established chain of events where underlying drivers, things like economic growth or improvement, drive changes to the landscape through proximate cause. So underlying drivers would drive me to say, go out and get my chainsaw and cut down forest. That me cutting down the forest is a proximate cause of land use and land cover change. In the Amazon, we have a lot of different drivers, both underlying and proximate, but the big underlying driver tends to be economic. The proximate drivers include things like road building. So here we're looking at a settlement road off of the Trans-Amazon Highway in the central Amazon. This is a bridge. Trucks go across that all day long. Pretty hairy to drive across, but infrastructure development, be it a big road or a small road, is going to drive deforestation to increase. Logging, of course, does as well. In the Amazon, much of the logging is actually for local consumption, but some of it does get exported. But there's a voracious use of wood for construction and even furniture and things like that in Brazil, and a lot of it comes from the Amazon. Of course, settlement formation is another thing that happens. People moving to the great Brazilian dictator / president Getulio Vargas said, we can bring people without land to a land without people. And that's been going on in the Amazon since the mid 1900s. And settlement formation is one of those drivers. And of course, agriculture, in particular, large cattle ranching or large soybean farming tends to be a big driver of deforestation as well. But I'm arguing in my research and in this presentation that another driver of deforestation can be land occupation, even things like this, which is a land occupation in the eastern part of the Amazon, where people have set up basically a town. And these can lead to deforestation, increased deforestation in a number of ways. So when I talk about land conflict, what am I talking about? Well, a lot of times we're talking about organized social movements, such as the movement of landless rural workers, but there are a lot of these movements and associations that agitate for what we call direct action land reform. Essentially, the argument that these social movements make is that they're forcing federal governments throughout Latin America, but particularly in Brazil, to actually enact land reform and bring people who would like to be farmers to land that's not being adequately farmed. Essentially, unproductive land should be expropriated and redistributed to those who are going to use it effectively. Here's the problem, though. In the struggle over land resources, people and the environment are put at risk. So, of all occupations, land conflicts that happen in the Amazon, I just realized some of these are obsolete data. It's actually been closer to 20% of all families involved in land reform. I've done so in the Amazon, and lots and lots of forest has possibly fallen because of this land reform efforts. And so the question is kind of what's the connection between land conflict and land deforestation? And this is what I call contentious land change. So one way to think about this would be, let's say that you have a 5,000 hectare property. That's a 10,000 acre property, and it's actually not too uncommon of a property size, especially when we look at large land holdings. And we have, so that would be here, 100%, let's say at the beginning, 100% of it is covered with forest, meaning that the amount of deforestation, which would be represented by these lines, is going to be less than that. And let's say that there's some upper limit of deforestation that is legally permissible. Let's say 50%. Currently, it's 50%. It has been 50% in the past. It's ranged as high as low as 20% being allowed, but the current amount is 50%, and it has been for quite a long time. Or it's been. It was that way when many of these large properties were established. So, over time, any land holding is in the Amazon is going to have associated deforestation approaching this legal limit as time goes on, just associated with what I would call agronomic or economic land change. Cutting down trees to establish pasture, cutting down trees to establish fields to grow crops in. And then, because we're talking about large properties and these are businesses, they're going to adhere to the law more or less. And when that happens, they'll approach eventually some point where they've reached their legal limit of deforestation, and half, let's say, of the forest will remain. But what can happen is when an occupation occurs, say at point A here, there might be a response like by the property owner to cut down as much forest as possible to show that they're currently using the land. And this is an issue because in Brazil and many other Latin American countries, actually, there is a legal constitutional requirement that land resources be used for social benefit. However, in most countries in Latin America that have this provision, social benefit is never defined. In other words, the law says the land has to be used for social benefit, but those without land would say, well, no one's working there, it's not producing any economic good, it's not producing jobs. Whereas the large, say, landowner might say, well, I'm speculating on this land and its increased value over time is a form of economic production, and therefore it is meeting some social benefit. It's helping the economy grow. In other words, both sides have their reasons for believing they're right. And in the Amazon, one way to prove that you're using land is to cut the trees off of it, because what's more useless than a bunch of trees? At least that's the thinking by many, not just large holders, but small holders too. So let's say occupation happens at point A, and by point B, maybe the large holder has cut down a lot of trees and has managed to get, in order to bolster their claims over the land, and has managed to get the police to show up and evict the land occupiers. When I say occupations, I mean this. I mean a group of people literally invading a piece of land, and that's a pretty common strategy among many social movements in Latin America that are agitating for land reform. Let's say at point B, the property owner is still in control and continues to deforest, perhaps in a liquidation situation where they say, well, now I know the social movements are interested in my land, perhaps I should eliminate or remove as much of the valuable timber as I can get away with. And so they might overshoot the legal requirement, knowing that there's not a good chance that they're going to get caught. But by point C, a reoccupation occurs. At this stage, maybe the occupiers are cutting down trees to do a variety of things: plant more crops, establish a settlement, even though it's illegal, or maybe cutting down a tree in order to pay a bill. So, a typical tree might go for as much as $400 if you can get it out to the road, and that could pay for transportation for your crops to town, or it could pay for a loved one to get medicine or to see a doctor, or pay for a hospital visit, something like that. By point D, though, maybe another eviction happens, and the large holder is now back in control, and deforestation levels off because the property owner might be in a wait-and-see situation. By point E, perhaps there's an expropriation. The land's taken away and given to these property occupiers. This happens most of the time after a number of years of back and forth, occupations, evictions, etc. And at this stage, complete deforestation generally follows pretty quickly. But the question is, we can observe this anecdotally on certain properties, with certain stories, with certain individuals, but we'd like to be able to observe whether this happens systematically, and then think about what that could tell us in terms of biodiversity and landscape preservation. So this is the problem. Well, one way to look at this is to find a contentious place. And while the land conflict is happening all across the Brazilian Amazon, including the states of Rondônia, Amazonas, and Pará, also Mato Grosso, this study and the work I've been doing focuses on a city called Marabá. Marabá has had intense violence. In fact, in the region, many people jokingly call it Marabala. In Portuguese, bala means bullet. And, this is definitely a place that's faced its share of violence. The study focuses on 180 large ranches. They used to be Brazil nut extractive reserves. Now they've been converted into ranches. They were converted into ranches in the late 1970s. The average property size is about 10,000 acres, pretty big. The largest one is 256 square kilometers, about the size of half the size of Cape Cod. It's a huge farm, larger than many Indiana counties, for example. And these 180 properties have had many land conflicts. But this region is no stranger to conflict. During the post-colonial period in the 1800s, there was a Cabanagem revolt. Essentially, people in this region decided to revolt from the government. There was an outright war, and fully half of the region's population was killed. In the 1970s, there was a Maoist insurgency called the Little War of Araguaia. This was much like the kind of Maoist and communist insurgencies we saw across Latin America during the 60s and 70s. And then, of course, during this time, kind of simultaneously, there was a fight over land between the people who had been there for a long time but had no legal access to the land. They just were there using it. And those people who'd been granted access to the land by the Brazilian military dictatorship. And then from 1984, political opening started to occur in Brazil, and different forms of claim making, political claim making, basically saying this land, I want access to this land and I'm willing to do something like occupy a property, began to happen and continues to this day in a process that we call direct action land reform. One question, though, is why did this conflict really start to bubble up starting in the mid-1980s in this region, which is what it did? And one way we can kind of learn about this would be, and unfortunately this slide gets cut off here, but one way we can learn about this is to apply the ideas of contentious politics, which come from political science and sociology, and were kind of put together by a series of authors like Tilly, Tarrow, and McAdam. Essentially, we have a series of mechanisms or pathways, if you will, by which contention arises that falls outside the normal political sphere of contention, basically normal kind of channels of political claim making. One of these is environmental mechanisms. Essentially, environmental mechanisms include things like resource availability or access constraints, essentially things not in the physical environment, but in the bureaucratic environment that change, that allow for access. In this case, environmental mechanisms, in the case of land conflict, included things like the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, which said land had to be used for social benefit. Another mechanism includes cognitive mechanisms, where people start to think differently about the place. They start to think differently about their relationships to one another. And then we have relational mechanisms, which are things that help people connect. In other words, in the context of a land conflict in Brazil, during the military dictatorship, occupying a property in order to gain access to it could lead in your death, murder, essentially. After political opening began, people started to communicate a little more, and they started to see that their problems and struggles were not unique. In fact, that they were somewhat common. And once that starts to happen, people start to get to connect with one another. And then technology plays a role as well, where during the 1970s, no one had access to a telephone. During the 1980s, this improved greatly. During the 90s, the internet began to be used to display the vast, gross injustices in the region, and also allowed people to connect their cause to other causes all around the world. You also can combine this idea with the fact that place is the idea of place, and this idea is a geographic one, and essentially that each place has its unique characteristics, but we can find common characteristics between places that enable comparison. Essentially, when we combine these mechanisms from contentious politics with environmental conditions, social institutions, the history, and the location of a place, we get a different outcome than we might otherwise. And I would argue that the South of Pará has this history, these social institutions and environmental conditions that constitute a pretty unique place, but one which can show us many things. One example of this process can be sort of the level of contention and how that impacts the environment. So here we have kind of a series of claim-making strategies. Some of these are not very contentious. They're things that you might see here in the United States or elsewhere when people are angry about something. Others, though, are more contentious, including occupation of land or even violent armed conflict. And all of these things happened on this particular property, Cabaceiras Ranch, between the mid-1980s and 2003. For example, we have all of these actions, both smallholder actions and largeholder ones, including things like occupations, expulsions, murders, vandalism, absolute vandalism and destruction of fish farming operations, occupations, killing of animals, reoccupations, the discovery of clandestine burials, protests, legal threats, all these things happened until eventually this property was expropriated, taken away from the private property owner and redistributed in the early 2000s. But as you can see, with all of these activities happening, we also see a decline in forest cover. And by the end, by 2003, it goes from 42% forested in the mid-90s to 27% forested in 2003. And notice most of these actions happened after in 1996 and afterwards. In other words, conflict and forest decline tend to occur at the same time. Now, how do you actually do work on this? Well, it requires a lot of work in site, right, in the field. And I did the initial data collection for this over 2 summers, spending lots of time working in a newspaper archive. Why newspaper archive? Well, at first I said, well, I'll talk to these people who've experienced land conflict and they'll tell me all the particulars. But the thing is, a lot of people don't want to talk about this, and in particular with the large holders, the ranchers, who are experiencing land occupations and coming under a lot of criticism, they really didn't want to talk about this. And initially they would approach my requests for interviews with a lot of suspicion, sometimes threats of violence even, but often after they got to know that I was a harmless academic, these meetings evolved into more pleasant evenings eating lots of beef on their cattle ranches or in get-togethers with groups of them even, social gatherings and things like that. But in other words, initially I thought I'd interview everyone. By the end, it was clear that they wouldn't have specific information that I needed in order to inform a statistical model to figure out what's going on here. And so I spent a lot of time working in a newspaper archive, reading lots and lots of news about conflict. I also did some interviews with key informants, including ranchers, social movement members, and agrarian officials. Spent a lot of time driving around, collecting ground truth data for imagery, and spent a lot of time fixing flat tires and bent wheels. I have to say that now, as we've brought this project into another stage, we spent a further month and a half on field work and data collection, including and are collaborating with Brazilian collaborators on getting those data together in order to improve and extend this kind of work. In order to develop a model to figure out whether there is really a statistically and practically significant connection between deforestation and land conflict, you need data. And so for data, we first needed data about forest cover. So we took over 50 Landsat 5 images from the Landsat satellite, which was in operation for over 30 years, almost 30 years before it finally destabilized in orbit. You take these images, these raw images, you georeference them so they match the location properly. You correct them geometrically so that every single picture element or pixel in the image is square and located properly. You correct for atmospheric interference, and then you have to take the spectral data, the light reflectance data, and turn that into classified maps. And then once you do that, you have to do accurate assessment and link this deforestation to properties. We link the deforestation to properties using a property cadastral, which I showed you a little while ago, 180 polygons representing property boundaries. But you also need other data, things to control for the quality of the resource base, because perhaps all this deforestation is economic rather than related to conflict. But you also need to know about the land tenure situation, who owns it, whether there's problems there, the size of properties could be an issue, title problems, whether a person actually doesn't have legal title, whether they've been violating labor law, which is a big problem, wage slavery, or just failure to pay workers is a big issue in this area. Environmental violations are as well. And then also information on conflict gained from newspaper articles, which would do things like gauge whether social movement organizations, SMOs, have interest in a particular piece of property, and also gauge the intensity of the conflict over the resource. So you can do this by adjustment to a simple regression model. Some of you might know regression, multiple regression. Essentially, you can predict the outcome of Y by a bunch of different, which is called a dependent variable, by using the values of a bunch of different independent variables. In this case, we have a number of them, including the passage of time, variables covering resource quality and the legal status of land, proxies for access to markets, and also conflict and SMO interest. You also have here errors, and in this case, because this is involves a spatial phenomena, in other words, things, property next door might have an impact on what happens on the property of interest, we have to include spatial autocorrelation. I don't want to dig too much into the technical specifications of this, but a spatial error model was able to capture the spatial component of this problem. And so model results, in some model runs, this is one example, not exactly the same one in the article that I showed you here, Contentious Land Change, but the results are consistent. The specification is just slightly different. And what we do here is look for statistically significant variables, which would be ones with very low values in the probability column, and then investigate their coefficients. In this case, we're looking at the independent variable, which would be hectares of forest remaining on property. And what we see is that hectares of deforested on a property. And what we see here is that that bigger than average properties tend to have bigger than average deforestation. The passage of time, about 100 hectares of forest a year, so that's 200 acres of forest goes away each year. And then for each conflict event, essentially, we have 30 hectares of forest loss. In other words, in a statistically and practically significant level, land conflict and land change or deforestation are associated. So when we do work like this, we're looking to figure out what's happening. And in this case, the passage of time and model spatial component of model errors are important, but so is deforestation, which is significantly increased on places where direct action land reform or dollar occurs. Dollar actions aren't significant on unoccupied properties if you separate them out. So places where there's protests over the land but not any real occupation, there isn't a significant situation there. So in other words, occupation is really a big driver. And when we actually do detailed studies of individual conflicts, which you could call like a conflict ethnography, it definitely points to the fact that contention increases deforestation. And so results like this have some policy implications. In other words, large holders have an incentive to clear. They want to show that they're using this land, but beneficial use is a big problem. What is beneficial use? What is social benefit in Brazil, in the Amazon? And maybe more measures or better measures of beneficial use besides forest clearance or economic value are needed. There's also a responsibility here that some smallholder colonists and occupiers might be increasing the amount of deforestation too. Deforestation remains a problem even after land is taken away from large holders and given to small farmers. Deforestation still happens. So just because the land conflict goes away doesn't mean deforestation does. So now, the problem with these results is they're only suggestive contentious land change. They're not going to really show you that it happens for sure. It just shows you that conflict and land change happen at the same time. There's a correlation. And what we need to know is things like, what do ranchers do when their land's occupied? Do they preemptively cut down trees in order to avoid future occupations? Do they liquidate the property's natural resources? Or do they wait and see whether the property is actually going to be expropriated or even occupied? Basically, control of the property might shift from time period to time period. And so we can have here kind of defined as control over the property, the event occurring, and then the actions taken. We could have an owner controlling a property, and occupation happens, and a direct action land reform movement is then controlling it. But there's violence and intimidation both on the part of the social movement and the owner, and also deforestation happening. But over time, maybe the original landowner, gets an order for reintegration or eviction. Police violence occurs, maybe protests, but they eventually are back in control of the property. They cause changes in land cover. Reoccupation occurs. The social movement organization, again, maybe does some deforestation of their own. Once the order of expropriation hits, the land is taken away from the original owner and given to these social movements. During all this time, there were multiple responsible parties. And so defining who's responsible is another big question mark that the current work that I'm doing in this area is really looking at trying to figure out. Anyway, this is a violent and difficult situation in this area. It still is violent. In fact, in May of 2015, there were 3 murders in and around the city of Marabá, focused exactly on land issues. So just because the data that I showed you here is from 2003 doesn't mean that the problem has declined. In fact, now I have data through 2010, and it is still very contentious, and also environmental change is significant. Anyway, that's how conflict and environment are linked, and also how environmental science can actually inform us how human behavior is changing the environment in this one case. Thanks a lot.